test, test. Everyone good? All right, we're getting warmed up. Speakers, panelists are kind of on deck, ready to roll. So is the moderator. You ready? We're ready? Okay. So we're just about time. In another minute, we'll be live on YouTube also. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Kevin, let us know when we're live. I'll get up on. We're live now. Okay. So Shashi, we're live. Let's roll with this.
Hello, everybody.
Okay, so I'd like to thank everyone for joining. I don't know what edition this is of our Global Energy Transition Summit. So the scope of the event is to bring key experts in the global, Canadian, and Ontario energy transition ecosystem to talk about various topics relative to how we end up decarbonizing the planet. So the format today is basically I'll make a short introduction about the event. I'll talk a bit about the energy transition, hopefully without getting in the way of our panelists or falling off the stage. And then our panelists will introduce themselves, their organizations, what their interest is in the particular topic today, which is energy storage. And my colleague Shashi will lead the technical panel answering various or asking various questions, and we'll hear the insights from them. Some of the insights our panelists will provide will be based on their current expertise. Some of the answers they give will be kind of like forward-looking, what if, we're not sure what's going to happen in the industry in the 2-year, 5-year, 10-year window. And there's a number of things that we have to look at. And so now I have to fiddle around with my phone because my notes are not on paper, but they're actually on a phone. So, and now I have to take off my glasses too so I can actually see my notes. I'll just start off with some background to energy and the energy transition. So in 1776, there was an inventor from the University of Glasgow who invented the steam engine. Anyone in the audience want to guess who this person was? Chris Galbraith from the audience wants to answer. James Watt. James Watt invented the steam engine in 1776. And this allowed us to suddenly burn dead dinosaurs to create industrial output. It's basically the birth of the Industrial Revolution started with the invention by James Watt of the steam engine. So moving gradually forward from there, anyone else want to guess what happened in 1776? Brandon. American Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution and the American Revolution are exactly the same age today. They're exactly the same age. So industrialization of the world economy, burning dead dinosaurs, and the emergence of the US as a world power have the same birth date. And so moving forward from there, about 100 years later, in Baku, Azerbaijan, it became the birthplace of the modern petroleum industry. So there were more oil wells in Azerbaijan within 6 miles of Baku from 1899 to 1901 than the entire US oil production. So all of these corporations started flocking to Azerbaijan, which also happens this year to be the host city and nation for the COP29 summit. So there you go, right? So the birthplace of big oil is now hosting the COP29 summit. So why is all of this relevant? Because dispatchable energy in the form of coal and oil are the foundations of the wealth creation of the Industrial Revolution. We are also seeing the impact of all of that on our climate, on floods and fires and all of that from 250-ish years of overburning for our industrial production and wealth generation to basically elevate the standard of living of people all around the world. And so now we talk about an energy transition. So the energy transition is like, how do we burn less fossil fuels and use more energy that is not carbon emitting, but how do we make it more like carbon emitting energy so we have it when we need it? So the ancient religions like the Greeks and the Hindus, they had random gods who were like wind gods and solar gods and all of that, because they actually didn't, they went and prayed to these gods because they didn't realize when is the wind blowing and the sun shining? Like, who controls this thing? Why is it blowing at the wrong time? Like my structure is blowing over because of the wind god, or the sun isn't there when I need it. And this is essentially the problem that our panelists are solving. How do we get the energy out of the wind and solar and be like the hand of God to the grid to move the energy to when the grid actually needs it? So fortunately, at this point in our industrial lives, we don't have to pray to random Greek or Hindu gods who, govern wind and solar. That humans have actually started figuring out how to do this. So building on that, I'd like to point to something in the stock market. So in the top 100 market cap companies, there's $4.1 trillion of market value concentrated in the market value of Saudi Aramco, Exxon, Chevron, Shell, and PetroChina. $4.1 trillion of market capitalization concentrated in the shareholders of big oil. The only company in the renewable industry that's in the top 100 market cap globally is NextEra Energy, and they're just north of $100 billion market cap, which is basically 41x or 41x of NextEra is what big oil is today. So we're at the foundation we're still at the very foundation of the energy transition. So how do renewables rise in value in the global economy? So some more stats as of 2023. So as of 2023, the world was onboarding 1 gigawatt of solar daily. And that's everything, from the village in Madagascar to the Al Dhafra 2 gigawatt solar farm in Abu Dhabi. So anything from small solar to these large solar deployments, 1 gigawatt is coming on board every day. Globally today, there's roughly 1 terawatt of wind generation capacity. What does that equate to, just for us to understand? That's about 50 times the amount of energy that Ontario uses on a given moment is what we have for wind capacity. China alone has 609 gigawatts of solar and 609 gigawatts of solar and 400 and something gigawatts of wind. So that's just in China. 45% of the Chinese grid is now fueled by nameplate capacity from wind and solar. So even though people say China is a big emitter of coal, what we have in front of us is this massive energy transition. Before, in the so-called warm-up area, we talked about an election that's next door and what that'll mean for the energy transition. But the unit economics essentially still take care of themselves. Otherwise, the Chinese government would not be investing in that. So while down south, someone might be saying, drill, baby, drill, if you listen to any of the coverage on any of the networks. In spite of that, the transition to renewable energy is happening in various capacities around the world. We gathered this panel today to talk about, like, how do we make wind and solar energy more dispatchable, more controllable, more usable like natural gas, like oil, like coal, with a combination of storage and intelligence and grid awareness. So basically, I'd like to close my part, but introduce the event with one more thing. We talk about sustainability and the energy transition. And right here today, we're in the home of the Ojibwe, the Cree, the Mohawk, and the Algonquin. They were the people who were here before most people here arrived. They lived with a very sustainable lifestyle, connected to the earth, living off what the earth generated without a big footprint per human. And I think there's something there that we can all aspire towards. And all of you working on the energy transition are a piece of enabling that, for us to go back to that. So that's pre-1776, Industrial Revolution, birthplace of the, or a birth date of the US. And prior to that, New France and New England and all of that were coexisting with the indigenous populations who were living in a much more sustainable manner. So with that, let's get into the guts of the panel. I'm going to hand the floor to our panelists, who will introduce themselves one by one, who they are, what their organization does, what their interest is in the energy transition and storage. And then my colleague Shashi, who leads our business development for our energy storage autopilot product line from BluWave-ai, will get into some technical Q&A. And for those in the audience who are online or are just getting exposed to BluWave-ai, our goal is to basically predict, optimize, control, and dispatch how renewable energy is used in smart grids and electrified transportation. With a home based in Canada for world markets, we're on the foundation. We're not a $100 billion company like NextEra, but you see the magnitude and the difference between the oil economy and the renewable industry. And we're all foot soldiers in this transition. So I'd like to thank everyone who's emotionally, economically, time-wise invested into the whole transition. So over to our panelists. So Jeff, if you'd like to kick it off, and we'll roll from there.
Sure, thanks Dev, and thanks for that history lesson. It's really interesting to see that come full circle there. I'm Jeff Wright. I work for a company here called Brookfield Renewable. Our offices are just over in Gatineau. For myself, I moved to the Ottawa region about 25 years ago from Winnipeg. I've been in the renewables industry for 13 years now, and the company Brookfield Renewable, we're chasing some of the market caps that Dev is talking about there. I lead development for Canada for Brookfield Renewable, and we are fortunate enough to have two large battery energy storage projects in west of Ottawa, so a 150 megawatt system and a 250 megawatt system. This is near and dear to my heart to have these close projects to us here. I've made the National Capital Region my home, and so it's very exciting to kind of be able to work on projects that are directly in our backyard. So that's my intro here, and maybe I'll pass it over to Raj.
Thanks, Jeff. Raj Patani, I'm with the Ontario Energy Board. We're the province's energy regulator for the natural gas and electricity systems. I run our strategic policy division. We advance policy proposals to facilitate innovation in the energy sector and to advance Ontario's energy transition. One of the things that we've been hearing a lot about in terms of energy policy in the sector is that it's going to require an all-of-the-above approach. And that also means that it's all hands on deck. So we're really grateful to BluWave and to Invest Ottawa for convening everybody, to your colleagues on the panel today and also in the audience that we've had the chance to chat with earlier. Excited about the discussions and about what the future holds. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is David Schwartz. I work for the Ontario's Independent Electricity System Operator. At our organization, we're responsible for system planning across the province. We work with folks like Jen and the LDCs to help plan the power system from the transmission level and upwards. We also do procurements for bulk, large installations of new generation on the province. And we also operate the grid 24/7, and we run an electricity market as well. So a lot of moving parts at the ISO. Again, thanks for the opportunity to be here. I think it's great. Should be a great discussion.
Morning, everybody. My name is Jenna Gillis. I am Director of Engineering Asset Management with Hydro Ottawa, so the local distribution company that supplies the majority of the city of Ottawa and the village of Castleman. I've been with Hydro Ottawa for 16 years, and I think we're finally on the cusp of a change. I've seen us talk about it for a long time, think about it for a long time, and we're actually seeing things take place. We're seeing innovation, we're seeing projects, we're seeing policy and regulation change to enable this stuff. So it's exciting to see what's coming next and where the market's going to take us and what people are expecting from the electricity provider over the next few years.
Thank you so much for your introduction. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. So before we jump in onto the questions, I have something to share, and it's about California. So we're going to talk about battery projects, and I'm going to share a story or like facts, basically, why battery projects are so important. In 2020, California issued three flex alerts, which is basically CAISO issuing alerts to all the users, all the consumers, saying that we have supply crunch, please reduce the consumption, otherwise there would be power outages. And there were just 3. And 2021, they were 8. And 2022, they were 11. Now, can you guess how many were there after 2023 and like in 2023 and 2024? Any guesses? None. And the reason is because California is so far ahead in terms of deploying battery storage energy systems that they grew from 700 megawatt to 13,000 megawatt in 2000. So 500 megawatt in 2018, and now they are around 13,000 megawatt battery energy storage systems deployed. So these systems help them provide grid stability and also not do the rolling outages or flex alerts or asking the consumers not to cut down their consumption. This is the importance of battery storage system. So today we're gonna discuss about how these systems here in Ontario's province gonna make a difference since energy demand is gonna go up high. And with that, let's go ahead. And my first question would be for ISO David, and then from Hydro Ottawa, Jenna. How do you see these energy storage systems, specifically battery energy storage systems, playing a role in terms of where the energy demand is coming from, and how are they planning? How are you seeing them support our demand growth?
I suspect our answers may be very similar, but I think essentially the ideal perspective is that the battery facilities start to levelize load. I think the expectation is when there's periods of surplus or prices are lower, when demand is lower, batteries will start to consume and charge themselves up. And then later in the day, whether it's a morning peak or an afternoon peak, they will discharge and help the grid that way. So to your point about California, it's probably way they were used. One of the other really cool things about batteries is they're really fast. So as a system operator, what you would like is something that can ramp up and ramp down very quickly, and so batteries can fill that void. So again, a great opportunity for that on the bulk power system. They're also just, again, that dynamic capability helps us manage challenges on the grid. If something happens, like we lose a nuclear station or we lose a transmission line, the system needs to readjust and be redispatched very quickly. And batteries are, again, the speed at which they can move is probably an ideal solution to help not only that, but a multitude of problems across Ontario.
So the problems that are at the bulk level and the provincial level are heightened again at the distribution level. So again, my answer is very much along the lines, and I think to Dev's introduction, is that batteries give us the ability to harness the wind and the sun and the water that we can't necessarily control otherwise. So the biggest advantage is that we can now use these renewables and then use a battery to plan when you're charging and discharging. So ultimately what we'd like to achieve is better utilization of our assets. So we plan our assets to operate under peak conditions, so under highest loading demand. So if we can reduce that demand, then we can utilize our assets more effectively and make make working with the ISO much more smooth if we have a more predictable load and stable profile, and that works all the way up into the bulk system. I think ultimately that just provides value across the board, and we're not worried about these peaking events and when they all coincide.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So with that, it makes sense for us to learn what the whole process looks like. We're predicting there's 75% increase gonna be there in Ontario's energy demand. Battery energy systems are required. But what is the whole process, right, from planning to contract, from contract phase to making these operational? And I guess, David, again, you would be able to provide us insight in terms of what ISO does. How do you plan? How do you foresee how many systems would be required? What could be the quantity, or what could be the, in terms of magnitude? And then probably Jeff can contribute what it takes from contracting phase to making these batteries operational. What goes into the planning and process?
Well, good question. I think it all starts really with trying to understand what the demand is across the province. And so we get inputs from industrial customers, from LDCs, from distributors. We basically gather that up and produce a long-term forecast. That helps us understand what the system may have to look like to meet that type of demand. So that means potentially transmission solutions, but ultimately sometimes you need new capacity. The planners, their first stop is actually conservation. It's typically the least cost alternative, and so we're seeing a big uptake in conservation initiatives. If we can solve a problem without putting new wires in or new generation, that's usually the best solution. And so when you start to figure out what the future need is, it's a simple conversation of production cost model calculations. They're basically crunching the math. What is the least cost solution? Conservation. And you work your way down the stack, so to speak, from least expensive to most expensive. And then when it comes to actually trying to solve the problem, we divvy things up after conservation, and we'll execute procurements. And so the ISO is responsible for, at this stage, acquiring resources for the province. So we've got two procurements that have run and have been completed. One's called the expedited RFP. Another one was a really cool name, long-term RFP 1. I know. Guess what the next one's going to be called?
Dev was asking. I was going to mention LT1, and Dev was against, like, don't use acronyms. So useful form. And I was like,
Yeah.
I searched long-term RFP.
Long-term RFP.
How would it explain what
Yeah.
is it? So probably you can do that job.
Yeah. So based on what the planners come up with about future needs, we execute those RFPs, right? Those basically we go out to the industry and say, hey, we need capacity, we need energy. We may need it in a certain location to help satisfy a local issue or a regional issue. And so we run those RFPs. It's a competitive process. We know companies like Brookfield have been successful in that RFP, and we're now in the building stage. So between those two RFPs, those proposals that we ran, we have just under 3,000 megawatts of storage that is being built currently in the province today. So that's a lot of where virtually nothing existed a couple of years ago. In a few more years, we're going to have almost 3,000 megawatts. So it's a big change in terms of the numbers and how we're going to have to use them. I didn't mention my job. I should have said that off the get-go. I had two things to do at the beginning. I only got one right. My job is, or my team's job at the ISO is to integrate this new storage technology as well as distributed energy resources. So I'm really keen to understand and trying to figure out how to effectively manage storage on the grid so we can utilize it for ratepayer benefit and reliability. I think, as far as like our path forward on the project, it's trying to figure out what is the least cost solution to using batteries. Again, it's like, when do you charge it? When do you discharge it? When can you send the right information out to those folks that own the resources to be able to figure out, like, when do I need to charge? When's my opportunity to make money? When's my opportunity to help smooth out demand? So it's trying to figure out how can the ISO help developers get the right information so they can make the right decisions that ultimately help the grid be successful.
Thank you. Jeff, do you want to contribute to that on terms of from contract phase to operational phase, what it takes, how it takes?
Yeah, thanks, David. I'll pick up from there. And I think we start with sort of seeing this as a technical process, and it starts by listening to the IESO. As David mentioned, there's a lot of work that goes into kind of understanding where the capacity needs are by region to kind of meet the needs of the growing system. And so as a developer, we spend a lot of time on IESO webinars that are very informative, listening to kind of where the needs are. And then we do recognize that these are competitive processes. And so once we've kind of heard where the need is, we think about where can we put proposals together that are going to be competitive and get picked up by these tenders. And so that sort of technical process is what starts things off. The next step, and is probably the most important step for the developers, and certainly as an industry, we could probably do a better job around this, but it's really getting out into the communities and talking to people about what these needs are, what's the equipment that we're putting onto the system, explaining kind of all the different acronyms of who the OEB is and the IESO and so on and so forth, which when we go into kind of, sit at the kitchen tables with the neighbors of these projects, people don't know those things. I mean, they sort of have a general understanding of how the system works. But I think, when you get into these open houses and so on and so forth, there's a lot of education that's required. And so we do partner up with all the kind of the regulators and city staff and so on and so forth. And there's a bit of an education session that takes place there. The other thing that we do as developers is we listen to the communities that we're building these things in. These host communities, they are sort of opening up their doors to these projects. These projects are very necessary for the grid overall, but this infrastructure does need to show up in certain communities. And so those host communities, they play a special role in all of this. And I think as developers, it's important for us to kind of earn the trust of those communities. And so we spend a lot of time working on that. And I guess the other element to all of this is, we have to put a competitive proposal together, but we also have to make sure that we're installing equipment that is sort of, high quality. It's going to stand the test of time. It's going to perform all the functions that are required by the system. But, most importantly, that it's going to be safe in the communities and that we're going to be able to kind of work with the local kind of fire departments and authorities to make sure that we're meeting all the standards and sort of hitting all the different regulations to ensure that the systems are going to be safe in these communities. As a developer, we are in this business for many years. We are going to be in this business for many years in the future. That the last thing that we want to do is put a system in place that has a problem. And so, we spend a lot of time with engineers and all the permitting authorities to make sure that things happen the way they should. And then finally, you get into sort of the nitty-gritty of project development, and that's sort of mobilizing capital to finance these projects, selecting the right equipment, working with the right engineering, procurement, and construction firms, tapping into all the local pools of labor and knowledge, and not just thinking about today, but also thinking about the future. And so, this is a growing industry. Energy storage is going to be a huge space for us as a developer, but also for the industry as a whole. And so we are working with local colleges to build apprentices and sort of build a skill set for the future. So, when you think about sort of from the IESO sort of technical piece all the way down to implementation, there's a ton of steps, and it's quite an interesting series of things that all need to come together. And so we do appreciate working with all the partners here on stage, but also all our partners across the city. So I think that sort of is.
That was pretty insightful. Thank you so much. So nothing comes without challenges. This is a new technology. Every day we hear something about it, and there are some challenges that we do not get to hear. Let's hear those challenges from OEB's perspective, as well as Jenna can contribute. What are some of the operational or regulatory challenges that you often come across with these battery energy storage systems or technology in general? One comes to my mind when question is like, when you charge the battery, it's considered load. And when the battery is discharging, it's considered generation. How do you see this dual classification going forward?
Thanks very much. I think one of the interesting things about the energy transition is that in Ontario, there's also been a transition in terms of our outlook with some of these technologies. And so 10 years ago, the sort of posture of organizations was more about ensuring that battery storage systems, that renewables have no adverse impact on the system. That was like the watchword for these systems. They come online and just make sure that the lights stay on. And moving forward, that posture of utilities, of government agencies, including the OEB, is shifting towards more about what is the opportunity with these systems? How can they help the system? And I think exactly what you pointed to, the lack of clarity that might have existed in the past about how storage is treated, whether it's a generation asset or a load asset, that's the kind of thing where there's friction. It causes friction in being able to conceive of these projects and connect them to the distribution system. That's one of the areas that the OEB was focusing on, providing regulatory clarity, reflecting that in our code amendments, streamlining processes and procedures to make it so that it's easier for people to connect to the system across the province, wherever you might be. And looking forward, a lot of our work at the Ontario Energy Board is more oriented towards unlocking the opportunity that exists with these new technologies. And so you can see this with some of the work that we're doing with respect to non-wire solutions guidelines. We're trying to equip utilities to be able to make the best argument they can about the investments that they're looking to make, including when those investments are going to be not related to concrete and steel, when they're not poles and wires, but when they're using third-party DER in order to meet a distribution system need. And that's very much the future. That's how we're going to provide ourselves with more runway in the energy transition as electrification increases. We also see opportunities in the area related to DSO functionalities, what people have been calling DSO functionalities. Sorry, we used an acronym, but government agency, it's in our DNA. And I don't know the full name for that one. Distribution system operators. So that's reflecting, that's basically unlocking new functionalities that utilities are able to leverage in order to leverage third-party DER using distributed energy resources and behind-the-meter storage in order to meet system needs more creatively. So we're doing some work on that as well to understand what does the future look like for the Ontario energy sector, and what do we need to do to ensure that utilities are equipped to be able to unlock that further value from DER and storage. I'll pass things off to Jenna.
Thanks, Raj. So, thanks, Raj. I'm going to pick up and I'm unfortunately going to start my conversation by talking about what you just said was kind of a bad word about the adverse conditions to the rest of the customers. And so right now, because we don't have a lot of experience with battery energy storage systems, we do treat them in a similar fashion to the rest of renewable energy connections. And then we do a connection impact assessment to ensure that they don't cause any adverse conditions for the rest of the system. What's unique about battery energy storage systems is we do have to do an evaluation for them from a load perspective as well as from a generation perspective. So we actually do kind of two assessments on them. And because of the way that we have the frameworks of these systems and that typically they're run by the customers for the customer benefits, we are looking to work with customers and come up with programs and mechanisms that we can see mutual benefits from these things. But the way that we have to plan our system is under worst case scenarios. So what essentially we do is we look at the generator producing during low load conditions, and we look at them consuming during high load conditions. So again, worst case scenario. Ultimately, this is not where we want to be. And so what we are looking at doing right now is moving towards kind of the understanding of the distribution system operator model and how can we leverage these devices to provide benefit to the customers, to the grid, and not, putting barriers in place by saying, well, we're just going to assume worst case scenario for all of these things. And so what we're looking at is what kind of data models do we need? And it really just comes back to the base bone as we're going to have to understand how these things operate. We're going to have to learn from them. We're going to have to understand what our customers are wanting to do and achieve with these things and what's right for our community. And so to do that, we're going to need information, we're going to need data, we're going to need models, and we're going to need to run these things and understand the implications and forecast where things are going to help with our customers, make sure that the solutions that they're presenting are not just providing value for themselves, but for the community and maybe ultimately for the whole grid. And so what all that means is we need to get better with data, and we need to get better with analytics and running these things and understanding the implications on the grid and for our customers and our community.
Thanks for touching on data and analytics. That's where my next question is heading. So before the next question, there's a basic thing. These battery energy storage systems come with basic software. What it does is basically start charging, discharging, takes care of the cell and the pack, voltages, current flowing through, but nothing more than that. It cannot sense when the sun is going to go up. Is it the right day to charge? What could be the whole generation look like? There's a generation forecast missing. It doesn't have an understanding of the load, like what the load's gonna be, how much would be consumed if it charges this much. And for all of this, there has to be some advanced solution. And this is where like BluWave-ai has its own solution, energy storage autopilot, What it does is it adds a layer on top of the basic software that batteries come with, and it provides a smartness that it can automate and optimize its functionalities. It can react to what is available in terms of what information is coming via data. And there's going to be a truckload of data going forward. So my next question is like, how do you all, probably for everybody, see this, technology sitting on top of the basic softwares or basic battery energy storage system that comes with? How would AI play in role, or data technologies in terms? There would be a lot of data. How are you planning to use that? How are you forcing usage of this technology on these systems? So maybe Raj, you can start first.
Thanks very much. I think data and advanced technologies are all about using the system more efficiently. So before, we used to turn to poles and wire solutions in order to meet demand on the energy system. That's still going to be required, especially in a growing, with electrification in a growing economy and demand growing the way that the ISO has forecasted. But artificial intelligence, using data and using software-based solutions can oftentimes provide cheaper ways to be able to serve demand in a way that we couldn't do previously. And so I think the work of innovators like BluWave and across the audience that we see here today is going to be critical to making sure that that happens.
Anybody can take this?
I'll maybe just add a small point to that, since I spoke a little bit about it, is that, like I mentioned, right now we planned a worst case scenario. That's not realistic, and that's not going to be able to enable these things going forward. And so what we need to get better at is understanding what is the optimal solution. So not the worst case, but what's optimal, and build frameworks and programs for our customers to participate in the market. And they're not just create barriers because of that one time a year when the system peaks, and if you discharge at that same time, it's going to cause abnormal effects. Okay, well, what are the operating parameters, and what are the agreements that we can put in place to enable this to move forward and not, and to benefit? And so that's where we need the information. That's where we need the granular level of information. We can't just do that, 1 or 2 times a year review of where the demand is on our system, where are the constraints. We need to have something that's dynamic and moving so that we can work with our customers to come up with these dynamic programs to allow them to contribute to the system.
Maybe I'll like, for the ISO real time, what's happening in grid today has already been planned, and it's there. It is about trying to figure out what the next 5 minutes, the next hour, the next days are going to look like. Trying to figure that out is a really big challenge for not only for us, but for distributors. And what's the right outcome? And how do you figure out with all these variables, like what's the wind going to be today? How sunny is it going to be? Which direction is the wind blowing? What's the humidity? What's expected to be on the system to generate? How much water is generating? Trying to figure all of that out and predict that is becoming more and more challenging. Again, there's just so much data out there, and to get it right. So I think, certainly AI could play a part in that. And if I look at, if I was a developer, I'm not, but I've heard stories from California, who probably has the largest installation of batteries that are used on a regular basis. Like, how do you differentiate one user from another? And it's about who can predict the future the best. How do you do that? You've got to, your point, it's not just turn the switch on the batteries and just hope it works out. It's all about opportunity costs. When do I charge? When do I discharge? If I discharge too early in the morning, can I charge back up so I can discharge later in the evening? How do you make that decision? There's a cost. Every time a battery discharges and charges, there's a cost to the long-term life of the battery. So how do you make that right decision? And I think of AI as again, being able to understand what the future looks like, and then being able to take the real world conditions and maybe a bit of history and hopefully provide that better, answer about the what if scenarios and how to actually operate batteries or any facility in the future.
Maybe if I could just add a final word here. I agree with everything that's said here. And AI is going to be big. Energy storage is going to be big, no doubt about it. I think what's exciting about sort of the stuff that we're doing here is to actually try to implement some of this stuff. It's great, this theoretical stuff about AI and energy storage and all that is really important. But I think what's really exciting about some of the pilot projects that are being done in the distribution system and with the ISO and the OEB and think about that, and then some of the large scale projects that are taking place here in the city of Ottawa, that sort of ecosystem allows that industry to get very, very concrete around some of these things. And I would say that as Canadians, we're great innovators, and we are taking charge of kind of all the domestic supply chains, thinking about how to build these systems, supply the minerals that are kind of going into some of the equipment, thinking about the software that's going to be used to operate these things and integrate them into the grid. So I think part of this whole discussion as well is I appreciate the work of BluWave and the team for assembling this panel here today to talk about that local ecosystem and how important it is to sort of take the theoretical stuff that we're doing and really put it into practice.
Thank you so much. So this was pretty insightful, and I guess I have these questions from my end, and I guess the floor would be open for everybody else to ask their questions based on what we have learned.
We'll,
Thank you so much, everybody.
My colleague Chris will have a mic going around the audience so you can pose questions to the panel. As we're getting organized for that, one piece of storage, and it's not the core topic of this particular panel, one piece of storage in the grid that is really important and is going to be a really high volume. If you think about EVs as a storage element hanging onto the grid when they're charging. Some basic math around it. So if you have 1,000 EVs charging at level 2 charging, which is 7 kilowatts. So if you have 1,000 of those, now you're at 7 megawatts of energy that's going into EVs. If you have 10,000 of those, you are at 70 megawatts. And if you have 100,000 of those, you're at 700 megawatts. So you can see very quickly how this particular asset class becomes either an asset to the grid or a challenge for the grid. And so in parallel, BluWave-ai has its EV Everywhere program that complements our energy storage autopilot. And we have today in the grid the ability for consumers to download our Android or our iOS application, register their car on our platform, and based on the amount of wind, solar, grid congestion on the grid, throttle their charging to basically assist the grid. We're deployed in the Hydro Ottawa service area, and later this month, we'll be launching a program all across Ontario to basically enable the Ontario grid with the batteries that are inside the EVs and have individual EV users get incentives out of that by being on our platform. And we feel that in the long course, combination of wind and solar, onboarding on the grid, fluctuating load on the grid, fluctuating EV charging on the grid, societal patterns, weather patterns, all of which are fluctuating, become an opportunity to basically enable this energy transition. So all the building blocks are in place today. And one cool thing about the EV side of this is we don't have to rely on major tenders and capital allocations. It's every individual person who decides to buy an EV is allocating their capital to be part of that energy transition and actually work with the energy storage and the renewable penetration on the grid. So I wanted to just kind of like tie that piece in to the audience here and online, because all part of the larger picture of what all of us are trying to implement. So Chris has the mic, and if there's questions for the floor, please go ahead.
Yes, my comment is primarily to the OEV. One of the things I have found, I run a microgrid, and I have an EV, home batteries, solar. And what is happening, of course, in other jurisdictions is the encouragement to pair both home solar energy generation and batteries, and then to bring those together into virtual power plants. And the virtual power plant then has a contract with the IESO to respond to their demands, depending on all the problems that they have to solve in real time. But this requires policies, of course. And are you looking at policies like that? And by the way, with batteries, I'm quite happy to accept that home batteries are not just power walls, they're also EVs, because that's a tremendous amount of battery storage that is available. And yes, it can be managed, I believe. If you're a microgrid owner and you've already got solar, I'm doing it, and anyone can do it. Your comments, please.
So with respect to hybrid facilities, we have a DER connections review. And the idea there is that we're looking at eliminating barriers to the connection of small DER facilities connecting to the grid. And so with hybrid facilities, what we were seeing was that there are people who have installed 10 kilowatts of solar on their rooftops within a relatively straightforward process. Because they're smaller facilities, you don't require the complex technical assessments. Then when they come and they connect battery storage, or they want to do vehicle to grid, the nameplate capacity goes above 10 kilowatts, and then the interconnection process becomes that much more complicated. So one of the focus areas for the OEB has been more oriented towards removing barriers to that kind of connections, that people who want to build those hybrid facilities are able to come onto the system with a more streamlined process and fewer costs for that connection. Now, with respect to the aggregations, that's something where I'll turn it over to Dave in a moment to talk about DER aggregations and participation in IESO administered markets. But before I do that, I wanted to talk a little bit about how those hybrid facilities, you're pointing to a great opportunity that exists for utilities as well. Because as those assets come online, it's not just a bulk system need that they're going to be able to meet. It's also a local system need that they're going to be able to meet. And so to the extent that LDCs have visibility on that, which is something that we've been trying to do through some of our code changes as well at the OEB, to the extent that utilities have visibility on that, they're going to be able to use those facilities in order to meet local system needs. And of course, now the DER aggregations and participation in ISO administered markets, I'll pass things over to my colleague.
So I think Jeff mentioned pilots early on, and I can maybe point to an example. It's a bit bigger than a home, but again, I'll relate it to Ottawa as well. So southwestern Ontario, if you've driven through Leamington, greenhouses galore. Like, it's incredible the amount of growth that's happened in that area. It's, I think in a few years, it's equivalent to the size of Ottawa as far as consumption. So what the ISO is doing is running a pilot down there to look at the greenhouses installing and pairing solar with batteries, trying to figure out, again, does it work? What's the price point? What makes sense? So we're kind of going through that pilot right now. We're trying to figure out if it's a behind the meter low displacement product. So we're trying to take the learnings from that, and then we'll come back and try and again expand and figure out what next steps are. So I just wanted to touch on that pilot. It's not like it is possible. We're trying to learn and understand that. Part of what my team is trying to look at going down the road is how do we enable those smaller? Now, those are like 50 kilowatt, that's not going to be on your house. Like that's quite a big facility. But how do you enable that at a smaller level? And so we don't have the answers to that, but that's part of the program is to look at, part of the project is to look at how we would enable that. And then the question becomes, does the ISO manage that, or is it better suited for an LDC? But ultimately, it is trying to figure out how do we model it, and then do we need to bring that up to the where the distribution system connects to the transmission system, or is it better off for the LDCs to manage that? So that's part of the ongoing conversation that needs to happen in the sector.
My name is Pierre Rivard. I'm a proud investor in BluWave-ai. Been on the board for 5 years, so thank you to the panel to come here today. I have two questions. The first one is, to what extent would the small modular reactors be a substitute to batteries in your long-term planning, and not necessarily a threat, but a displacement solution to the technology solutions? The second question is picking up on Jeff's final remarks on how we can actually build the Canadian supply chain for all of the positionings in the supply chain of the services and the goods so that we essentially move our economy from resource extraction to value-added activities in this revolution occurring in energy? And what are the ways and means to do that?
I can take a crack at SMRs, sorry, small modular reactors. So I think they're very different. Well, obviously, they're very different technologies and very different uses. Batteries, again, help with that period of time where you've got a little bit extra on the system. That could be through wind. It could be through solar or just base load nuclear running. So SMRs are small, these reactors just run flat. There's very little deviation in them. And so that's like like Niagara Falls, it just runs. And so batteries can complement, anything that's base load because maybe there's a little bit extra available during those off-peak periods. You can use that energy to charge and then be available to kind of top up the system during those morning or afternoon or winter peaks later in the day. I can't really comment on the supply chain issue though. Not sure if anybody can here.
I mean, I'll just sort of reinforce the point that we do need to think about how do we take control of the supply chains, because ultimately these are great skills to build our infrastructure here that's needed to electrify, but also these are skills that can be used to export. And so, one of the things that I'm quite proud with Brookfield Renewable, I mean, it's a global company, it's multinational. We've got operations here in Canada and the US, but all over the world. And it's really fascinating to see kind of my colleagues and my peers kind of develop some skills here and then go do a project in Australia or go down to Colombia and provide advice on something. So, I think, but the consulting firms in Canada, they also export a lot of those services. The software can be exported globally. So, I do think that as Canadians, as we go through this electrification and sort of put clean, reliable energy on the grid, that's not just important for us, but that's also important for sort of the Canadian industrial strategy.
Pierre, perhaps from the innovators angle, I can add a bit about our experience in terms of kind of enabling a Canadian supply chain, working with partners here in Canada and around the world, both partners who are consumers and partners who are technology partners to help deliver the solutions. One of the, so if anyone has read Michael Porter's Competitiveness of Nations, it's all about having a discerning home market. So if you're a company that produces hockey sticks, then having a discerning home market in Canada gives you global competitiveness because your own market consumes your products and it sharpens, it hones your skill for the export market. Conversely, if you're an auto manufacturer in France, typically French consumers don't care to the same degree as German consumers, as this was an example used in that book. And therefore, the German brands seem to have a step up on the French brands in terms of automotive. So from a startup innovation angle, all of us, right from the research ecosystem to the commercialization side, we can't control how discerning our home market is for electricity related products or EV related products. So ideally, we can do it in our home market, but we also have to look at export markets around the world who will be early adopters and leverage that to raise capital or even in some cases get different layers of financing from Canadian government programs and all of that. But yeah, ideally, Canadian supply chain can be a bigger fish in its own backyard. That's not, I think, inherently in the Canadian industry, we are from an innovation side, we're very active. But from a looking at all my peer companies in different sectors, but from a consumption side and our multinational companies, our government and all of that aren't as risk-taking as in the US market or for that matter, even in the Middle East or in the Far East. Perhaps that's because they've been able to leapfrog technologies by leapfrog in different categories by adopting new technology, because that's the only way they can actually get ahead versus incumbent nations who are already ahead from a wealth and GDP perspective. So I think that's just the nature of the economy we play in. And that's my observation from the ground.
Thank you all for your insights. At a recent PEO sustainability seminar, the gentleman sitting to my right shared a statistic that we're expecting demand on the grid to grow by 75% by 2050. So what's keeping you up at night?
So by disposition, I'm not really an optimist. But on this subject, I am optimistic. 25 years ago, this conversation about battery storage and DER it would have been a pipe dream. It wouldn't have been taken seriously. And today we're having a panel discussion. We've had many, you're hearing at the PEO forums that you just referenced there, serious conversations about unlocking behind the meter storage at people's homes in order to meet system needs, in order to meet capacity needs. IESO just acquired almost 3,000 megawatts of storage and now is going to run one of the largest procurements. I'll leave that to IESO to cover. We have a huge advantage when it comes to the supply that we have for power in this province, and we have a huge advantage in terms of the reliability of power that's delivered to consumers here, and that's very attractive to investment, and that is a virtuous cycle to me. The investments in power generation, the investments in transmission, the investments in distribution, making that attractive for private capital to come, both for power system infrastructure and for economic growth generally. So 75% increase in power demand by 2050, that's a daunting figure, but the industry has done it before. And so if I can finish off on this note, that we can only have these conversations with optimism because of the hard work of innovators like yourselves, the organizations that you represent, the utilities that are on the stage and that are otherwise working in the sector. So thank you for that work. And I do feel optimistic that we're going to be able to lean into Ontario's clean energy advantage to meet the demands that you just articulated there.
I think for me, if you'd asked me this question 5 or 10 years ago, I would have had a long list of things. But I think, again, to the point of the fact that we're sitting here and we're talking about it, and there is, published information that we're expecting a 75% load growth, gives me reassurance that people are aware of the issues and we're coming up with creative solutions to solve them. So everybody recognizes that you can't just go out and install more poles and build large generation stations that can supply this capacity, and we are looking at creative solutions to solve these problems at all levels, right? You've got the full suite here of people who can participate in this market and solve these problems. So I think the biggest thing for me is, I mentioned that when I introduced myself, is we've been watching this come, and I think we're finally at the cusp of doing something about it, right? So like I said, 5-10 years ago, you would have asked me, I would have said this is coming. Nobody's talking about it. There's no policy changes. There's no regulation changes. What are we going to be doing about it? And I think we're finally at the tipping point where there is recognition all the way across, all the way from the users to the producers, focused on the same outcomes, making sure that we continue to deliver a reliable, resilient grid for Ontario. So I think at this point, I think we're all moving in the right direction. So I'm optimistic that we're going to solve these problems together.
So it's a huge challenge. Let's not kid ourselves. It's a huge challenge to make that much of a change in a sector that's been relatively, I won't say dormant, but status quo for a while. But what an opportunity now for folks to innovate. It forces folks away from the same old, same old. It forces innovation. It drives innovation. There's things that will probably be on the grid in 2050 that we haven't even thought about yet. So again, there's that hope that's out there. There's a lot of things that are going to have to get built. It's not different places of Ontario, but the opportunity is there for folks to find an innovative way. It doesn't have to be batteries. Maybe there's hydrogen. nuclear, different, again, I can't even think of the solutions right now. And I think hopefully there's people out there that have some really cool ideas. But I think it's just the opportunity there is huge.
So I'd like to add to your question. Unlike Raj, I'm a built-in optimist. Otherwise, you wouldn't be foolish enough to start a tech startup in this sector. Having said that, if you take an average car that drives, let's say, 20,000 kilometers a year, it's going to go through it's going to spend $300 on electricity this year, or $3,000 on gas. So if you put 1 million cars on the street, it equates to $3.3 billion net into the Ontario economy. So Jeff, I think you're going to a meeting with Doug Ford later today. So please pass on to Doug that 1 million EVs on the street is $3.3 billion net to the Ontario economy, because it's $0.3 billion spent on electricity and $3 billion less shipped to OPEC. So usually what ends up happening is if there's money in the game, good things can happen. So all the challenges that we're talking about actually require money. Without money, none of it can be solved. So what electrification actually presents, and this tremendous load growth, is actually a transposition of money spent on OPEC to our electricity sector. So it's actually more money staying right here at home. And actually for every electrification-centric jurisdiction globally, they end up putting more money in their own pockets versus exporting the money to oil-producing regions. Thus, you see why China has 45% nameplate capacity of solar and wind. They're not only doing this to have cleaner air. But that load growth actually, it's not all, if you look at the overall energy load growth, it's moving from, that 4.1 trillion market cap going to the top 5 oil companies to $0.1 trillion market cap going to renewable companies. So some of that money will move over. We're told that in the next 2 years, we're going to reach peak oil revenues and shipments globally, after which they'll start to gradually decline. So yes, electricity growth is projected to go up, but in parallel, the amount of energy from fossil emitting sources will start to reduce. The net of all of this is cheaper energy and cleaner energy, and then that money can then be reinvested into DER connection programs, into larger storage projects, into more wind and solar onboarding, into CapEx to spend on software to manage all of that from BluWave. So having said all that, there is a generational opportunity in that load growth that all of our panelists here are trying to do their part in enabling that ramp to that load growth. And there's a lot of pieces and moving parts to enable that to happen. So if you look into the 1800s, Rockefeller went around and put like oil at every corner for home heating. And then suddenly Henry Ford released the Model T automotive vehicle, and there was oil at every corner from home heating that could now go into the cars. We're going to actually have the inverse of that going on. So in the 1800s, it was oil at every corner going to cars, home heating and cars. Now we're going to have electricity at every corner going to cars and home heating, resulting in your load growth that you're speaking of. So the panelists here, they're all from kind of like key enabling organizations that will make kind of like this transition happen, tip the balance from that 4.1 trillion big oil to the 0.1 trillion in renewable, kind of gradually the other way. So I think we're Unfortunately, we're still on the ground floor. There's a lot of people a lot younger than me who will actually operationalize the big transition over the next 20 years. But between all the organizations here and the innovators and the research labs, Ontario and Canada are well positioned. And 3.3, Doug Ford, that's the number of billions of dollars annually that the $1 million of EV will enable. So please, everyone, talk to the finance minister, talk to Lecky, talk to Ford. Lots of money here. Carbon will happen on the sidelines. Anything else from the floor? Two more. Okay.
Hey, I'll keep this one brief. Thanks, guys. Carl Helsler. I've worked a lot in greenfield renewables over the last 12 to 14 years, done a few gigawatts of wind and solar, and now get the pleasure to dabble into the BESS. Really excited time to, be working in my career. You guys have had a massive undertaking, and Dave, I think this question is probably primarily for you. You're on a steep growth trajectory, which is running in parallel with all these other global markets, energy markets that are doing the same thing. They're all producing more renewable energy at a massive scale because electrification is needed rapidly. Now, with that can come premiums, can come extra costs. We kind of seen that a little bit in Ontario. They definitely saw it in California. And, and at the end of the day, this generally affects the ratepayers, your time of use and your fixed ratepayers. It's a question I get asked a lot and kind of have a shaky response to this. So I just wanted to throw this out there. What is your guys' strategy? There must be a balancing act. Like you need the energy, but you got to do it at a practical cost to the ratepayers. Can you kind of elaborate, like what are the key strategies and decision-making process that, leads us towards a certain technology to maintain that balance? And then, how that actually impacts the time of use ratepayers? Like, does it actually benefit them in the grand scheme? Does it drive the costs up, or does it kind of like taper off the escalation? Are you able to kind of just elaborate that at a higher level?
I think I'll go back to the comments I made earlier that when we're looking ahead, it is trying to figure out the least cost solutions. And I guess I'll say it again, we start with conservations. Typically, if you don't have to build anything to generate or build any new wires, chances are that's the least cost solution. And so we've been running a program through the conservation framework now from 21 to 24. It's been quite successful. Again, we rolled out pilots with Hydro Ottawa within the Ottawa area, down in Essex, trying to learn from that. And I think we'll see that, hopefully expand as we go forward. But then, you start to go, what's the least cost solution? Recognizing, I think that, their costs are going to be, we're trying to keep things affordable. I think that's at the end of the day, as that's our mandate, is to try and keep it affordable as possible. As you grow the system, again, this is where the opportunities can arise, right? If someone has a solution that it can help manage those costs, then they've got an in over the traditional resources, right? So it's about trying to find those opportunities to enter the market and take advantage of what's out there. I think that when it comes to time of use pricing, I think ultimately what we're trying to do is just trying to manage that affordability. And when those prices are like essentially the way that's calculated by, again, ultimately the OEB, it's about all of that plays into the time of use pricing. But again, it's all about, trying to manage that overall cost. And can you find that, batteries, like I'll point to batteries again. Again, traditionally you would build every resource had to be able to produce energy to get to that magical peak that might happen you're building the entire system for that 1 hour that happens once every 10 years. And now you can build that same peak, but they don't all have to produce energy because you can use the energy from when you've got surplus and save it and now use it when you've got peak, right? So that's an opportunity now that didn't exist a few years ago. So again, that helps, I think, with affordability. But yeah, I agree. There's lots of challenges when it comes to supply chain. We don't personally work with suppliers, but we have lots of interactions and meetings with them. The global supply chain is expanding. We keep hearing about new factories being built, new facilities. The cost of production keeps dropping. But again, we can't control it. I think one of the things we want to be able to do is provide a kind of that continuing steady framework as opposed to like big bangs. I think that ultimately the sector would benefit from some sort of a kind of a regular framework of of predictability when it comes to installation of new resources.
Could I jump in here? So as Dave alluded to, Ontario Energy Board sets some of the pricing for retail customers, the regulated price plan. And so we have time of use pricing that's available there, and we have an ultra low overnight rate that's available there as well. And that all goes to the heart of the affordability question that Dave alluded to, and your question had at its heart. At the OEB, our primary objective is always protecting ratepayers and doing things that are in the interest of ratepayers. And in order to ensure that this electrification and this growth occurs in a way that still protects ratepayers, we have to use a whole suite of solutions. So I spoke earlier about the work we're doing on non-wire solutions and facilitating the adoption of non-wire solutions to more cheaply meet system needs. Another piece of the puzzle there is also customer choice and making sure that the price signals that customers are exposed to result in efficient behavior. And so time of use pricing is one of the ways that that's done for people that are on the regulated price plan. And we also have other initiatives in flight to make it so that larger customers, industrial customers, are also exposed to price signals and have more opportunities to use storage, for example, to reduce their impact on the system, have beneficial impact on the system, because they're responding to these price signals that are more reflective of the costs that those customers are causing. So again, just to recap, it's a whole suite of solutions that are going to be required in order to make sure that the growth occurs, the investment that's needed occurs, and it's done in a way that's always in the ratepayers' interest and in the public interest.
We're running against clock here now. So we're going to wrap it up. And as Jenna said, this is a full suite here, from distribution to policymakers to system operators, from getting things operational, from technology perspective, we're going to make it all smart. So there's a lot of work for us. The industry is booming, and it's predicted like by 2050, the energy storage market could be about 1,500 gigawatt. Today, for context, it's about 100 gigawatts. So BluWave has a lot of work to do. Let's add smartness to these assets. And thank you so much for all the knowledge that you shared. And we learned a lot, I guess, right? Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, audience, for joining us. We really appreciate it, both here physically and online. So look for the next one probably in March or April of next year.